Hello everyone and welcome to this fourth session of the sixth week of the Angular development course. In this session, we will be focusing mainly on what is HTTP interceptors and how it can help us in enhancing the project. Whatever we have seen so far applies to a single instance of a API call being made from a component or service to an API endpoint, as I showed to you guys, right? So what I have done basically is I have made an API call from an app component, made a call to the JSON type code server, fetched the data, and I have shown it. And also, as you would have seen, I have handled the error and I have kind of manipulated the response, and if required we can also add the request headers, so on and so forth, using that single block of code that we wrote. But imagine, as I said earlier, if you have to write hundreds of API calls, so it is not a good practice that repeat the same code again and again for all the basic things that has to be done for each of the API calls. Say for example, if you have to add a default request header to each of the API call that is made, or if there is a global error handling which you have to do. So say for example, if any of the API service fails, you want to kind of restrict, redirect the user to the error page or show them a error message. So if you have to implement it on a per API call level, that is not a good practice. So rather, we should have some global mechanism which can handle this automatically, right? So for such scenarios is where we have the HTTP interceptors, and that is the most appropriate utility for handling this. So HTTP interceptor allows us to intercept incoming or outgoing HTTP request when we are using HTTP client. That is very important. So as we saw earlier, we make API calls using HTTP client. So only when you use HTTP client will you be able to use HTTP interceptor. So by intercepting the HTTP request, now we have the ability to either modify or change the value of both request and response, right? So there are three common use cases of HTTP interceptors. This is again important for you from a project and interview perspective. So whenever you want to handle any HTTP headers, as we saw, so say for example, as we are going to see now in a while, if you want to add a specific header to each of your HTTP call, so you can use HTTP interceptor. Similarly, if you want to format your response, say there is some specific method you follow in your application, but your server is returning your response in a different way. You can kind of format your response or add certain keys or remove certain keys and do those kind of manipulations from in the response as well. Similarly, you can also do error handling, as I said earlier. So say for example, if any of your response is failing and you want to kind of redirect the user to a error page or show them error or perform some other operation, you can do that as well. So now let's try to see it in action. So before we get into the code, I want you to first visualize it on how this HTTP interceptor actually works. So assume I have a bunch of components in my application, and each of these components are internally making different API calls. So one could make one could make two, one could make five, four, there could be a bunch of API calls which are being made. So earlier, as I said, if you're going to define each of these error handling or request and header heading and all that things individually, so you have to write or repeat that code these many times, which is not the ideal practice. And even in future, if you're going to add a new component or a a service which is going to make another API call, the same thing you have to repeat again for this as well. So rather, what we are going to do by HTTP interceptor is, so HTTP interceptor, you can just imagine it to be a tunnel, okay? So whatever API calls you make from your project, okay, irrespective of which component it is made or which service it is being made from. So whatever API calls you are making, it will pass through this HTTP server to your actual API server, okay? And this is nothing but your HTTP interceptor. So what happens over here is, while this request is being made, using HTTP interceptor, we have this ability to modify the request header or the request itself. So say in my application, I have a requirement that any API call which is made to the API server should contain what is the user name, or it should contain the user location or any such data. I can add it automatically using HTTP interceptor. Similarly, if when I get the response back, right, from the API server, it could be either a success scenario or a failure scenario. Using HTTP interceptor, all those API calls, again, I have the ability to read what is that message or that error, and based on that I can perform some operations as well. So say for example, if there is a scenario wherein I'm logging all the API data that is happening. So whenever I get a API response in my UI, like on my Angular application, I could make another API call in background which would log the status that at this point of time this API call was a success. So something like that, like logging mechanism. Or if it is an error, so then I could just use a Angular router or some other mechanism and just redirect user to an error page, or show them a message which says that hey, we encountered an error and please retry, or whatever you want to show, right? So that is the concept of HTTP interceptor. So you can just think it is a tunnel through which all your API call passes, and since it is a tunnel through which all your API call passes, you have the ability to kind of manipulate both the request that is being sent and also the response that is being received. So with that being said, now let's jump into the code and understand how can we create an interceptor. So before we create an interceptor, what I'll do is I'll just create a bunch of API calls so that we are clear that it is really working. So what I'll do is, and also I will not handle any error over here. So response I will handle because since I have to show it on the HTML, so I'll just have this dot post equals to response just to let it work. And over here I'll just also create another API call. So where what I'm doing is I'm just kind of making a call to this to dos, and this URL I will just change it back. And here what I'll do is here also I'll remove the error. Okay, I'll just have the response and I will just console log the response, and here I will say to do it. Okay, so just to see if it is working fine, what I'll do is so I'll just go back to my UI and I'll see that my to do API is returning, and also whatever profile API data I was getting, I'm getting it on the screen. So which means now my application is working fine. Now let's assume a hypothetical scenario. Okay, to all the whatever API calls I am making on my server to my server, right? If you go to the network tab as I said and you click on this photos and you come to the request headers. So assume as part of this request header, I want to send a key value pair which says username, and say assume I want to send Angular. Okay, and similarly the same username Angular should also go for to dos as well by default. I don't need to add extra code for it. How can I do that is by using interceptor. So now let's see how can I do that. And similarly, if my user makes a wrong API call to some API URL which is not existing, I want to show that user an alert message or maybe an console log error or whatever it may be, which also I want to do it globally. So I don't want to do it on a per API level basis. So how can I do that? So let's try to implement it using HTTP interceptor. So the first thing that you need to do to implement HTTP interceptor is you have to create a service. Okay. So how to create the services? As I said, whenever you are creating any new files in Angular or updating the core project configuration, ensure that you are killing the server by pressing Ctrl C in the terminal. So that will kill the server. Then just clear the console. And after this, you have to now create a service, right? Okay, which is an interceptor. So what you'll do is ng generate. We are going to create, there is no a specific file called interceptor. It is still of the type service because it's going to be a singleton class which is going to get instantiated once across your application. So what you'll do is you can create a service and we can name it as interceptor. Okay, and just press enter. Okay, so this has now created a service for you. So the next step for you is, let's now go into this interceptor service and see what is created. So this is the default or the template boilerplate code that comes to us. So the next step over here is now we have to extend this service to act as an interceptor. So how to do that is very simple. The first thing that you have to do is come to this export class, and remember, by the way, it's not required that you only need to have one interceptor per project. You can also have a bunch of interceptor. So say for example, one interceptor you can just focus for adding request header, one interceptor could just focus for modifying the response, and one interceptor could focus just for performing error handling operations as well. So it's not necessary that you should have only one interceptor per project. You can have define as many as you want. Okay. So the first point, the first thing that you have to do before convert a service into an interceptor is you have to implement the HTTP interceptor class over here. And later what you need to do is you have to import this HTTP interceptor. So how to import this? Yeah. So this is how you import the, so there's a typo over here. So we have now implemented HTTP interceptor as part of a service, and you see this red error over here because we have implemented this HTTP interceptor, but we have not still defined the intercept over here. That's why it's throwing error. That is fine. But for now, this is step one. So remember that whenever you have to create interceptor class interceptor, first you create a service like this. Second step is in that service you then go and just ensure that the class is implementing this HTTP interceptor interface. Okay, the next step over here is we have to now define a intercept method. So ensure that you are using the same name because this is required by the HTTP interceptor interface. Okay, you have to use the same name which is intercept. After that, you have something called a request. Okay. And you will have, and this request is of the type HTTP request. Okay. So the next we will have, since it's a observable, we will have something called next. So next, if you remember from yesterday's session, we said that next is nothing but whenever you want your observable to pass the next value, you use next operator, right? So this is nothing but your HTTP handler. So observe that whenever using autocomplete, whenever I press that, so automatically it is importing those specific things for me automatically over here. So always ensure that it is getting imported, or else you will get the error. Okay. So this is step number 1. So after this, I have to now return, declare what is the return type of this intercept method, right? So this intercept is going to return me a observable. Okay. And the type of that observable is going to be a HTTP event. Okay. And the data which can go through that can be of any type. Okay. So this is what I am telling over here. Okay. So we are getting error over here because we have not yet defined it. So once you define it, it will be gone. Okay. So now let's take the first condition where we have to add a default user, like a request header to all the class. Okay. Okay. So what we will do now is this. I just added the comment for your understanding. Okay. So now let's take a hypothetical situation. Okay. So this rec that you see over is nothing but the request which passes through this request. Okay. So what I can do is I can just do a rec dot clone. Okay. I just can clone the existing request. Okay. And inside that, what I can do is now I have the ability to touch my headers. Okay. So I'll just give this headers over here, and here now I can say request dot headers dot, if I have to set a new value, I'll just use the word set. Okay. And here now I have the ability to pass a key value pair. Okay. So say now I say I want to give the user the key of this as, say, maybe username. Okay. And the value I wanted to pass it as skill link. Okay. And similarly, I want to also set another user header. So here I would say maybe course name. Okay. And the value I want to pass it as Angular. Okay. So this is what these are the two request headers which I need to set before making any API call to the server. Okay. So this is step number 1. So after this is done, the next step that we need to do is we have to now return the observable so that it continues with the journey. So for that, what you need to do is you just do a return next dot handle and request. Okay. So now just to check if it is working fine, what we will do is we'll just start a server again. So we'll just go back to the terminal, give ng serve -o, and we'll just close the current project which was created earlier. So now the API call is made, and as you can see, we can see the data. So now let's try to see whether the request header, whatever we added, has been added to the API head calls or not. So for that, it's very simple. Just go to the network tab, click on this fetch etc, clear if anything is already there, and refresh it once. So we see that there are two API calls which are being made. So I'll click on the first API call, and remember that it will take some time for you to see this on the UI, because this being an API call, it will make a call to the server, and depending on your network speed and all, it will take some time to render. Okay. So I will just click on this photos over here, and I'll just come down to request headers. So here if you see, yeah, so here you'll see that still this request header is not yet added. And why that is not yet added is, I'll tell you the reason. If you remember yesterday, we said that any service is going to be a singleton class, and it will be instantiated once and being used. But in case of HTTP interceptor, there is also another extra step which you need to do. So for that, what you need to do is you have to come to the app module.ts over here. Okay. So in app module TS, if you remember yesterday, I said that whenever you want to import a service into your module, you can either do it from provided in root, or you can also manually import it over here using providers. So for your HTTP interceptors, there is a special configuration which is required, which we need to import over here. Okay, only then it will work. So what is the configuration is? So this is a pretty much standard syntax that we use. So first we'll write it and then I will explain what it is. So now we have written it. Now let's try to understand what we have written. So what we are saying to our application right now is, so in my app module, in order to use, see what this provide HTTP interceptor means is, every provider has to have a kind of a injector, right? So that way we are telling it is that you have to use this provider of HTTP interceptor, and we have implemented this HTTP interceptor using this interceptor service class which we have written, and we have set multi to true. Multi is true because, as I said earlier, your application can have multiple HTTP interceptors as well. So that is why we always keep this multi to true. Okay. So this is a common syntax that we use. So the next time you write another HTTP interceptor, all you need to do is just copy the same object over here, comma, paste it again, and only just change this HTTP service to whatever new service name that you write. That's it. Okay. So this HTTP interceptor, since we have used autocomplete, it has now automatically imported from Angular common HTTP over here. Okay. So that's why I say always use autocomplete. So as you type, you will get suggestions. Click on that. So automatically it will import it for you. Okay. So now we have done with setting up the HTTP interceptor. Let's go back to the application and let's try to see if that works now. So if I click on to do and if I come over here, you see that now the HTTP interceptor is working right now. You see, because I'm seeing now the course name is added, and also I see that username is now added, which is showing username as skill link and course name as Angular. Okay. So similarly, if I go to photos, here also I see the same thing. Can see that now the username skill link is added in my request header, and similarly the course name Angular is also added along with the other basic keys that I have. So this is the way how we can add request header in our HTTP interceptor. So the next I'll just show you a sample implementation of how can we also manipulate a response as well. Okay. So this is not necessarily required in all the projects, but that also we can do. So I'll just show you a basic demo of how we can capture, like handle request and also the error as well. So coming back to the interceptor that we created. So here, if you see, we have just returned the next dot handle and directly we are returning the request and the response that is coming from the server, right? But what if I want to kind of now manipulate the response I have? So for that, we have a RxJS pipe operator called as pipe. Okay. So what pipe does is, whenever you get one observable, right, it will then pipe it, and pipe in the sense it will then chain it to another observable or another operation, and that's how it continues. So here what I can do now is I can now use another RxJS operator called map. Okay. So map is essentially nothing but it basically maps the response for the observable for us, and we can perform some operations inside it. Okay. So just stay with me. We'll first write the code and then we will get into what we have done. So this map is throwing error because we have not imported it. So just ensure you import it from RxJS like this. Okay. So now what I'll do inside map is, so I will just take the same response which is received over here, like from my response, and here I will just do a simple console log. Okay. So I'll just say console log. Okay. And I can return this. Okay. So what I've done over here is, earlier we were just returning whatever observable we had directly, and we let the application handle it. But now what we are doing is we are piping it, like we are basically chaining it. So the first part of chain is we are first mapping it. So what the map does is it will take the observable whatever you got, which is essentially the response we are getting from the server. And instead of now me just manipulating something in there, I'm just directly console logging it, and then I'm returning the response as it is. So after this point, the application gets the response as it is. But just to show you that the HTTP interceptor can also manipulate the response, I just did a simple console log over here. Okay. So to see this in action, if I come back to my application and I see the console log, you see that for the two API calls I made, you see there are two logs which is coming. So one is telling this response has passed through HTTP interceptor, and you see one is for photos, and similarly the second is for to dos. So this is what I said, like you can manipulate your response as well using HTTP interceptor. So I will say manipulate response here. Okay. So the next part which I want to show you guys is how can we handle a error on a global level. So what I mean by that is, so say if both of my API fails or one of my API fails, how can I handle it globally? For that, we have something called as catch error operator in RxJS. Okay. So using that, you can, if there are any errors in your observables, you can catch it. Okay. So how to do that is, you just take this error as argument, and before we do anything else, we have to define the type of it. So this, since it's a error, it is of the type HTTP error response, which is here. Yeah. And overall, this function is going to return me an observable which is of the type HTTP event, and it can contain any response. Okay. So don't worry about the errors. Still, we have not defined it. That's why you are throwing error. So what I'll do now is, so let's just take a normal scenario. Okay. So what I'll do is, whenever I get any error, okay, I just want to kind of console log something. Okay. So I'll just say, okay, and after this, we have to now throw this error back to whoever is subscribing to it. For that, we need to do a return throw error. So this is how we kind of just catch that error and throw it back. And inside that, we need to define a simple arrow function which instantiates a new error and throws that error with that. Okay. And here you don't need to have a error. You can also define your own message if you would require. So you can just say error in API, just for example, right? So that's it. So now let's see this in action. For this, what we will do is, okay, so this API is passed. What we'll do is, we'll go back to the app component.ts, and just the way we did it last time, right? Now we have not handled error here. So if you see that, I will also remove this error block. So just for you to ensure that you understand that we are not handling error in the component level itself. Okay. So if you see, now our code is quite lean. We are just doing the HTTP get and HTTP post or whatever calls we want, and we are not handling any errors or setting any objects over here iteratively. I will also make one more call for post. So just to for you to see that it also works for any API type. So I'll just comment this second in between. I'll just make one get call and post call just for you to understand that it works for both the ways. So I come back to the application. You see that there are two calls which are made, and one is still in pending. So pending means we are not received the call. Now we got it. If you go to the console, you see that one you got for post call, one is for the get call. So both are working fine for in our case. Okay. So now what I will do is, I will purposefully type an invalid URL. So I'll just give photos 123, and for post I'll give post 123. Let's see what happens. Yeah. So you see, for both of this API now, the interceptor caught it for us. It says that received error in API, caught at interceptor itself, and it is telling for photos 123 the error is 404, and similarly for post 123 it is telling error 404. And how I'm telling it is caught at interceptor, because you see that whatever message we typed, the same message is coming here, which is coming at this point, right? So we are console logging it. That's why it is console logging. So instead of console logging, when you actually write your real-time application, you could route your user to other view page, or you can make another API call which might log this event as an error in your some of your logger you may use, like Splunk or whatever. So those are the use cases for handling the error. Okay. So coming back to the code, so I'll just put a comment over here that handle error globally. So for you to understand what are the three things we have done. So as I said, it's not necessary that you have to put all this thing in the same interceptor itself. You can do it you can have ways wherein you can have one interceptor handling just request, one interceptor handling just response, and one interceptor handling just error. But ideally, if you ask me, if you have a small project, or your interceptor is going to do just small things, it's okay that you can add all of that in one interceptor and just add it in your app module. Okay. So with that, we have come to the end of this interceptor concept. I hope you understood all of this clearly. So let's summarize what we learned in this week. So we learned that a parent to child communication happens using @ input decorator or through @viewchild or local variable. A child to parent communication happens through @output decorator. And we also understood how to make API calls and manipulate response and error received from API using HTTP client. We saw what is HTTP interceptors and where to use it. And we saw how Angular service can be used to perform specific functionalities which can be used across any component. And we also saw that the observables are a superior means to handle asynchronous programming, just for an extension from the last week. We also saw a few RxJS operators like map and pipe and all that thing. And these are the references which I want you guys to go through, like from the official Angular documentation, which will like help you to understand this even more in detail. And with that, thanks a lot for your time and looking forward to see you in the next week. Bye.